What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the Crucible. I'm your host, Andrew Wilson. Tonight we got Econo Boy against Philosophical Zombie Hunter. Maybe his name was like too much to fit in the little fucking box, because it just says PZH now. But how's everyone doing? Right, it's Friday, right? Everyone's probably pretty happy about that. Unwind Friday with a Friday night debate. It's a little early. I wasn't even really able to advertise this one very well. Usually I'll send out a tweet or a few, but while the intro's going on, I'll do that. So we're going to get started in just a minute, and I'll be right back with our debaters. End of a long week of community debates. But this is a good note to end on. Econo Boy versus Philosophical Zombie Hunter. Looking forward to this one. We saved the best for last. Econo Boy, introduce yourself to everyone where they can find you.
Yeah, sure. Hey, everyone. Name's Econo Boy. I think I've debated on the Crucible, a few times at this point. Hopefully, you guys have all liked it. If you didn't, it's probably because you're wrong, and you should adopt my positions. I guess in terms of if you want to learn about economics or politics, you can always go on the Econo Boy YouTube channel, Econo Boy Discord, Twitch channel, all that kind of stuff. Mostly talk politics and economics. And yeah, that's pretty much my deal. Thanks for having me on, Andrew. Yet again, you've chosen to bring a champion instead of debating me yourself, like a real man. But I wouldn't expect anything less from a guy who calls himself Big Papa Fascist.
Well, I mean, that's it's just mean and cruel slander, Econo Boy. I would sue you, but for some reason, by the sound of your voice, I feel like you don't have any money. Philosophical Zombie Hunter, tell everybody where they can find you.
Hi. I am on YouTube/Philosophical Zombie Hunter. I'm also on Twitter. I assume the details will be in the description of the video. And yeah, I do debates and just like chill talks on my YouTube show. That's pretty much it.
All right. Well, gentlemen, the topic here was not determinedly set. We have socialist economics against libertarian economics. I guess that could be rephrased maybe like laissez-faire versus, Keynesian, or maybe any number of different things. We may change the title post-debate, but it was a good placeholder. What we'll do is we'll let you guys kind of outline what your economic positions are, and then we'll move into the debate. Philosophical Zombie Hunters, you're the challenger. You're going to go first. You have 5 minutes.
Thanks. So I've come to debate my system called 90% UBI, which is essentially a generous UBI to every man, woman, and child of a certain age of around $1,000, at the cost of reducing the government by 90% to pay for it. The system would need 2 constitutional amendments: freedom of contract and the freedom from unequal benefits. The latter can be phrased in the following way. Henceforth, federal, state, and local government shall make no law nor establish any program that provides benefits to some citizens but not to all. Programs currently provide such benefits are to be terminated. The funds formerly allocated to them are to be used instead to provide every citizen with a cash grant beginning at the age determined by Congress and continuing until death. I think governments are an important part of society, but the problem is that they have a heck of a lot of failures. Because of that, we need to use them in a limited and targeted capacity while letting the market solve issues in a bottom-up and efficient manner. Scaling back our burdening government regulations and interventions in the economy will increase the economic liberty of our country, something that has been researched and concluded to have higher economic growth rates, lower unemployment rates, higher gender-related development index, lower forced child labor rates, higher human development index, higher human capital index, higher life satisfaction, higher ratings on the OECD's Better Life Index, and the higher environmental performance index. According to the US Chamber of Commerce in 2016, federal regulations alone cost the US economy an estimated $1.9 trillion a year in direct cost, lost productivity, and higher prices. We need to start thinking more long-term about the efficiency and productivity of our economy, an economy with more things being produced and lowering the price of those things over time helps everyone live a better life, and over time enables more and more people to have access to a greatly improved standard of living. In the 90% UBI, I am suggesting to remove most of the mandatory spending in the budget, meaning all corporate and social welfare will be removed and consolidated into the UBI. Subsidies, tax breaks, and general favoritism and cronyism will be removed and replaced with a simple tax system that applies equally to everyone. Healthcare and education will be moved to the private sector and follow a natural market trend of reducing prices over time and increasing value. Payment for these sectors will be included in the UBI with an option of buying additions if you require it. Other positions in the proposal that can be expected from my position include decriminalizing drugs and releasing prisoners on small possession charges, ending no-knock raids and civil forfeiture, a move from a vast global military presence to a smaller presence with more get-in, get-out military strikes when needed, and a reduction of overheads. In summary, the current governmental system is robbing the vast majority of us of a good and fulfilling life. This time we recognize where the flaws in our systems are and adjust them once and for all.
Thanks for the opening statement. Holy shit, I'm actually curious about this. Econo Boy, you've got 5 minutes to respond. Go ahead.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess to do kind of what Andrew said, I'll just kind of lay out my general economic ideology. Yeah, I'm not a socialist. I'd call myself a capitalist, progressive capitalist, Democrat, social democrat, whatever you want to say. Pretty much, I think that the profit motive makes a lot of sense in a lot of circumstances. I like markets a lot. I think some commodification can make some sense, and I feel like most people agree on this. Most people would typically advocate for a national military, some national industry, right? A lot of conservatives even like the USPS, stuff like that. I think can make a lot of sense as well. In terms of how I would view the role of the state in regulating those markets and that profit motive, I think it's very important. I would say that in general, what I would advocate for is progressive income taxes, progressive capital gains taxes that are taxed the same as income. I think payroll taxes can make some sense for funding some basic government services that everyone can pay into and pull out of, like Social Security or Medicare, or a broader sort of universal social apparatus like a Medicare for all style system, if we were to propose such a thing. I suppose in my ideal society, I think that more or less my ideal society kind of exists. I think that the Nordic countries are pretty good examples of governing economies that I would support, and ultimately where I would see sort of the basic end stage of the relationship between the government and the economy going forward. I think that unionization is a great thing. I think worker board membership is a great thing. Yeah, anything that generally can empower workers in order to get a better say, in order to advocate for themselves, get better wages, and then to the extent that predistributive measures that I just described don't work, that's where redistributive measures to me make a lot of sense. Taxes and redistribution, food stamps, Social Security, things like that. Unemployment insurance. We can consolidate those programs in a number of ways. I'm not quite a UBI guy, I guess, like Philosophical Zombie Hunter. I think a negative income tax is better than a UBI for a number of reasons, but in general, I guess we might get into that in the sort of forefront of the debate. Now, I do subscribe to um, some sort of post Keynesian ideology, right? Which is to say that some governments have a privileged fiscal space, right? The U.S. government creates debt that it pays back money that it pays back in its own currency that it creates, and so that gives extra fiscal space. I think stimulating the economy and full employment should be somewhat persistent goals of the government, and I think taxes, especially in viewing that sort of relationship between money creation and debt issuance. To me, taxes are especially important in terms of reducing income inequality. Yeah, and that's kind of where I am. So we can get into it, I guess, at this point.
Floor is open, gentlemen.
All right.
Thanks.
Well, philosophical
Um,
zombie hunter. Let's do it. Where do you want to start? I don't know where to start.
I had a question.
All right.
So I understand that the US isn't really the ideal system that you would prefer. I would assume it's 80 or 90%. Well, I don't know, depending on you. I do have a question that I am curious about. Currently, there are all these vast social programs in the US. I think since the war on poverty started, the US has spent around $27 trillion fighting poverty. There's around $2 to $3 trillion a year in entitlements and other benefit spending. But
Oh
the
no.
US has 553,000 homeless people. I'm not clear on why these particular people have been kind of left over. It seems to me that the focus of the programs that even you suggested seem to be more focused on income inequality, on people that need $100 or $200 here and there. But I don't understand why the homeless situation in particular is so aggressive in the US and why it hasn't been dealt with, considering the amount of money that's already been spent on it.
Yeah. I mean, I understand that type of thought process. We kind of have to go program by program in order to evaluate the effectiveness, the efficacy of those programs overall. Most of what you're describing is money that's been spent on Social Security and Medicare. I think that it's important also to point out that the quote unquote war on poverty was not a persistent and targeted government effort. Obviously, it had been undermined by immediately subsequent administrations, the Nixon administration, the Reagan administration, even the Clinton administration to some extent, right? The Bush administration. So, I mean, I don't really think it's fair to say that, yes, the government has had a narrow focus for the last 60 years on government spending as a means to alleviate poverty. It's not really true. And I think that when we talk about the big factors that contribute to that, whatever that 20 something $1 trillion number that you mentioned, basically Social Security and Medicare is like 80 or 90% of that. I think that those are two programs that are, I mean, essentially wholly successful. Obviously, we can nitpick here and there, but I think that the world was made a lot better place with the presence of those programs. And I think that in the absence of those programs, the world would be made a lot worse.
Okay, but what about the homeless people? I mean, I think the idea of the war on poverty originally was a sort of like it was marketed as a sort of attack, like the US recently cleared up Europe in World War II, and they wanted a similar kind of cleanup war for poverty. They elected a sergeant, I believe, to run the program. The idea was to go in, go out, shock and awe, fix all the homelessness, or sorry, when I say fix all the poverty, and in addition, they also targeted it in a way that to reduce dependency. Let me just check something here. So it
Yeah,
was targeted as give a hand, not a handout. We must find a way to help far more of our dependent people to independence. So
sure.
it, it seems to me like the money has been spent. I'm not sure the idea was necessarily just Social Security, which I don't think started there. I think it started before. And Medicare and Medicaid were like amendments to the health bill. It wasn't designed originally to be as big as it is today, taking like a vast majority of a vast chunk of the yearly spend. So it was supposed to be like things that give independence, jobs, helping out when you need it, and a variety of different programs. There was the the Office for Economics Opportunities Act or something like that. So it does seem to me that money was spent, and you can say it was undermined, but as far as I can see, even under Nixon, it was certain things were 10 times more than they were before. Over time, it grew and grew and grew. I don't think it's actually shrunk per se. I mean, I know that Clinton tried to reduce something, but it doesn't seem to me overall that it's drastically been savaged to nothingness. It's still a very expensive program that are running today. And I'm
Yeah, it's
asking in
been
particular the most vulnerable, where have they been left out?
Yeah, it's been made more inefficient over time. When you look at the social spending over time, oftentimes what you're seeing in that regard is people living longer and taking out of those systems more, and less so like real increases in benefits. And if anything, like in the case of Social Security, for instance, the retirement age, they're not going to cut quote unquote Social Security, but the retirement age has been raised in order to receive full benefits. And so stuff like that is happening in order to make these programs either inefficient or less attainable for people across administrations, which to me aren't really good things. When you're talking about homeless people, I think that homelessness is a complex issue with a variety of solvencies to it, all of which are not necessarily equally important, but also important. And I think that other countries are good models. I think that would be kind of a dumb way to go down this debate is to say that yes, the American welfare system is bad in a lot of ways. Therefore, we should have a UBI and cut 90% of government involvement. But that's not a reasonable argument. I think that what's more reasonable is to say is that there are systems that I would advocate for that to me have a lot of demonstrable empirical success, especially when it comes to taking care of homeless people. Um, and those are the systems that I would advocate for, similarly to how you're advocating for a system that hasn't been enacted in America either. So I'm not going to defend the sort of, historical failings of the US government to extend welfare holistically to its people. Obviously, there's problems there. That's why I didn't say that my ideal society was present day America. I said, my ideal society to many great extents is the current Nordic economies.
Okay, I appreciate that. You did mention inefficiencies. Would you say that over time the welfare system has become more bureaucratic and more inefficient, and that has an effect on how it is able to help certain people, and an effect on how efficiently the money is being spent?
Yeah, I would say it's become more bureaucratic, but I think a lot of that bureaucracy has been created artificially, right? When we have all of these different sort of standards by which you can achieve your benefits, right? That's where you end up with a lot of these administrators and bureaucratic inefficiencies. Oh, you can have this many assets. You have to look for this many jobs at this time interval. You have to get laid off for these reasons, not those reasons. If you leave your job, right, you have to be below this income or whatever it is. I mean, these are all things that have been implemented by the government to make it harder to get welfare. And ultimately, those things can be taken away. So the answer is yes. But I think that to me, that's not a critique of those apparatuses overall. It's more a critique of sort of our governing philosophy of those systems.
I think it has a very big factor in it. I think that the bureaucracy and the inefficiency is just inherent to the systems. It will get worse over time as political parties change. Every politician is going to add something to I don't know, pot. And overall, I think it's kind of like the nature of the beast. That's why I think that my system will be beneficial, because we're cutting out a lot of those bureaucracies and bureaucratic bodies, and just replacing them with straight up money. Now, I would assume that straight up money would be relatively there won't be too many overheads that reduce those transfers to those people. So technically, all those people will be eligible for $1,000, and that could help, I assume, most of them get out of homelessness and live a good life.
Not necessarily. I mean, I think that the problem is that everything you advocated for are internalized with a negative income tax, but I think that you end up losing a lot of people along the way when you start getting rid of things like, healthcare systems, social security systems, things like that. I just don't really see the rationale behind it. Obviously, if you have some ideological predisposition against government involvement in the economy or government in general, then I can see where your system makes sense. But in terms of what is better for most people and what's better for especially the lowest income people, I don't think taking away their health care, their social security, their food stamps, their housing vouchers, and then giving them $1,000 a month is a way to solve that. There have been analyses that have been done on this before, and people have pointed out that the lowest income people that receive the most benefits would have substantial benefit cuts if they were to switch from basically the assorted welfare programs, even in America, that they have, which is not the most generous welfare programs, to $1,000 a month UBI. And so this is where I think a negative income tax solves that problem uh, by giving people net benefit increases or just the same benefits that they have before. It saves a lot of bureaucratic inefficiency that you would be worried about. A bunch of administrators coming in telling you how to get benefits, when to get benefits, and it encourages market distribution of dollars, and it encourages I mean, basically just people, hey, if you're lower income, we trust you to do with we trust you to do with the money what you will, and spend it however you want. So, I think that system is a lot better than the one that you described.
I'm not really talking about low income people. I'm talking about no income people. It's
Yeah, I
not
mean,
so. I don't know necessarily if.
a no income person would be eligible for a negative income tax as well.
Okay, but I still think like a generous one-time payment, as you said, well, one monthly payment. As you said, we trust you with this money. With regards to Social Security, this is still something that goes on even if you're not working and when you're retired. So it's
Right.
pretty much a very straightforward help, like generous help to those who need it.
Yeah. Yeah, but
And
everything you just said is true with a negative income tax as well, except it's a quarter the cost, and it allows lower income people to get probably at least 50% more money than with a UBI, right?
but this
So
is
a
equal to
negative
everyone.
that's what I'm saying is that a UBI, because because everyone gets it, because it's a minimum amount. I think you mentioned
Mhm.
$1,000.
Yep.
That's $12,000 a year for 250 some odd million adults in the country. That's
Mhm.
$3 or $4 trillion a year, assuming it's adjusted for inflation. Well, at least right now, that would be increasing to some substantial degree. And at the same time, if you had a negative income tax at 130% of the poverty line, which would be about 18 grand a year, as a federal average, that would be about $700 billion a year. And so it's a quarter of the cost, but it allows lower income people to get much more money. It'd be much more targeted, and you wouldn't have to dismantle many of the other assistance programs that people rely on, like Medicaid, Medicare, Social Security, all that other stuff.
Okay, so if everyone has access to $18,000, why aren't homeless people having access to this money?
No. I'm advocating. I'm not. A negative income tax doesn't exist in our current system. I'm saying that my proposal, like I think I mentioned in my opening statement, like maybe the one thing that I would change about the Nordic economy is I would do more cash benefits. I just don't think a UBI is the right thing to do. I think a negative income tax is the right thing to do. My ideal system versus yours, I think internalizes a lot of those benefits, but is way better for lower income people.
I think there's an advantage of not dividing society up between different classes and different races. Everyone having one equal payment throughout the system, I think, benefits that. I mean, the amount currently is $1,000, and yes, it's between 3.2 and 3.6 trillion, but it is calculated for in the 2019 budget. But I feel that is more connecting between societies. So there are not these divisions that we had before around the time of the war and poverty. There were all these people that once the benefits were given, they were fighting over them. So there were struggles between races, there were struggles between classes. Now that we have like a sort of everyone in society gets this, no matter what, when they're retired, if they're fired, if they need anything, not just low income people or magically becoming low income people, just always. And children also get it as a thing for going to school. So I think that overall kind of equality and removing a lot of the bureaucracy out of the system, a lot of inefficiency out of the system, I think has a net benefit to overall society. Obviously, like if as a result of removing regulations and removing the government intervening in the economy, there's more money generated, and the monthly amount can be changed. But the idea is that people getting a generous amount of money, no one telling them what to do about it, is reliable, it's always there, and the inefficiency with bureaucracy or different means testing or proving certain things, all that is out of the window, and you can just rely on it.
Yeah, I think that I would agree if if certain things were true about the negative income tax, but they're not, right? So I don't really think we're creating distinct classes of society. I think rather that we have a lot of benefits that are universal in nature. Social Security and Medicare are, like I said, the two biggest things that contribute to the U.S.'s social spending, and pretty much in the entire world, the two biggest things that governments do for people are their retirement systems and their healthcare systems, and those are pretty much entirely universal benefits in most every country that I can think of, at least all the developed countries I can think of for sure. And so that's one thing. Number two is that a lot of people who you might consider like higher income or middle income get the negative income tax as well, because we're not, to me, a negative income tax wouldn't be based on household income. It would be based on individual income. So, those stay at home dads and moms who aren't earning an income would qualify for the negative income tax. Those people who volunteer for their communities, who have the time to because they're supported either by their families or their spouses, they would qualify for the negative income tax as well. And it would also be a benefit that everyone would rely on, especially when they become unemployed, right? This is something that could replace unemployment insurance. It could replace, the earned income tax credit, right? I mean, a lot of those kind of things, right? And so I don't really agree with that kind of assertion. And if anything, I think that the burden to prove that that's actually a big problem is on you, right? I don't really think that one of the reasons that we have struggled to advance the sort of cause of social welfare and workers' progress across time is necessarily because of income-based benefits that we give out. Personally, at least that's to me not been borne out in many other countries across the world.
Sorry, what do I have to prove? I didn't understand.
Well, it seems like one of your contentions is that, oh, well, a negative income tax creates distinct classes of society. And I think there's a lot of empirical examples that prove that that's not true. And I don't really think that you've proven uh, with, I guess, reasonable certainty that a UBI, even though it's 4 times as expensive and way less redistributive to lower income people, is worth it just because, oh, well, the intrinsic benefit of everyone getting the same payment is so great. I feel like that's hard to prove, but that's what your burden to prove is, if you want to convince me at least.
Well, I was specifically talking about the historical situation with the war on poverty, not negative income tax. But similar to what you've said, I mean, if people
well, wait, but I don't know why.
Hang on. Hey, Econoboy, let him finish this point real quick. Go ahead, man.
Okay, sure.
But similar to the points that you said, I mean, caregivers would obviously get a UBI. People are able to contribute more to the community. If someone would rather contribute to the community instead of getting a job, they can rely on the UBI. If it can, to some degree, incentivize starting families, if that is the case, which I don't think is available in the negative income tax. But yeah, I mean,
yeah, I mean, everything you're saying is
I'm not going to
within the
contend.
negative income
I'm not going to
tax as well.
contend with specifically what you said, because I didn't set out to prove the negative income tax specifically. I was just mentioning a point on the war of poverty that happened.
Yeah, I don't really. So we're comparing alternative systems here, right? It just seems weird to say, yes, everything I mentioned was problems with the war on poverty. So it's not applicable to the negative income tax. But then when I talk about the negative income tax, you bring up those same problems again, right? And so either they're applicable or they're not. Now, we can go program by program, right? I think that in a world with a negative income tax, we would still have a government health service. We would still have Social Security. We would probably still have housing vouchers, things like that. But every benefit that you just described, people starting families, people within households that are doing uncompensated work, that would all be internalized with a negative income tax. I think that your system is very bad for a lot of reasons, because by dismantling those other benefit programs and those other government apparatuses, we end up with poor people being a lot worse off for a lot of reasons. And that's not the same. That's not true in my system.
So you're saying that in the current budget that we have of 4.4 trillion, you can add negative income tax and solve more problems than mine can.
Yeah, for sure. I think that one of the analyses that I found on the costs of a negative income tax was that 133% of the poverty line, which is 18 grand a year ish, would cost between 700 billion or $1 trillion a year. And insofar as that replaces other expensive government programs like unemployment insurance, maybe even food stamps, things like that, as long as it's obfuscating those kinds of things, the earned income tax credit, then to me, I don't really think we would add a ton to the government budget, and it would solve basically all the problems that you just laid out as well, without having to, reduce, like you said, reduce 90% of the government's expenditure, or the 90% of the government sort of administrative apparatus.
Well, mine is factored in; it doesn't add.
I understand. That's what I'm saying, is that under my system, we wouldn't have to cut the government by 90% in order to, have all those same benefits.
But you said you're adding $1 trillion or $700 billion to the budget.
Well, okay, so yes, but the negative income tax obviates the need for many other government forms of government welfare, right? Like you don't
So if you're
necessarily
replacing
need.
that's fine. So are you saying negative income tax is a replacement for certain things, or does it add to the budget?
It does replace certain things. Like I said, you wouldn't really need an earned income tax credit. You wouldn't really need food stamps. You wouldn't necessarily even need housing vouchers. You wouldn't need unemployment insurance. You wouldn't need a lot of forms of welfare that we have today if we had a negative income tax. That's what I'm saying. Insofar as it adds to the budget, I mean, even if it does, I mean, there's a lot of there's a lot of reasons why we might imagine that funding such a program would still be worth it. But I'm not sure it's demonstrable that it does add to the budget anyway.
Well, I'm a bit cautious about stuff that adds to the budget. Right now, we're on $31 trillion dollars. I was trying to keep in or less than the 2019 budget, and I know that there's a lot of obligations for the US to keep. I'm aware that there's 220 trillion in pensions or social security probably, and I'm just conscious that we are trying to cut things in a certain way that we don't increase the budget. So because there is a deficit, sorry, and we do want to have
Sure.
programs in a particular way that don't add to it. So this is the benefit to what I'm saying.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I agree to some extent. Obviously, you don't want to blow up your budget to some incredible degree. But to be fair, again, that's not really what I'm describing. I don't really think it's demonstrable that that would happen under my system. And insofar as it does, there's obviously a reasonable tax burden that you could impose on mostly upper income people to balance the budget. Now, to be fair, I don't really think that necessarily balancing the budget is like a goal in and of itself that is worth pursuing, especially when you have the circumstances that the U.S. and many other developed countries have in terms of paying back its debt and the structures of its debt. I just don't really think it's the most unsustainable thing for the government to invest in certain programs or certain people, because to me, at least, you end up getting paid back for many of those types of programs that you might run a deficit to do.
Don't you at the very least concerned that we've increased the budget basically every 8 years? We've doubled it. Sorry, not the budget, the deficit.
You're talking about, well, I don't know if the deficit's been doubled every 8 years. I guess I'd have to look at that. But even if it is, I wouldn't necessarily be concerned about that, because to me, the limiting factor on the U.S.'s debt sustainability is institutional strength and inflation. Insofar as those two things are true, it's not necessarily the case that a deficit itself is bad, or that a deficit needs to be repaid in the future with like real economic growth, or with like real increases in tax receipts, right? Um, because the U.S. has a lot of institutional strength, and because inflation isn't becoming so much of a problem, we can still issue bonds in our own currency, repayable in our own currency, I should say. And therefore, we have a lot more fiscal space than many other countries. We're not unique in that regard. There's about a dozen countries in the world where that is the case. But no, I just don't think that the deficit isn't so scary that we should cut 90% of 90% of government. I mean, I just don't think you're. I think that you have to grasp with the reality of that. I mean, there's so many programs and benefits and institutions that would be completely dismantled. The types of institutions that gain the U.S. its credibility in order to issue the type of debt and have the type of reach internationally that I'm describing, which I think would
I
go
don't
away.
think with my plan touches those ones in particular. But are you under the impression, or have you read studies that say that the bigger the government debt, the slower the economic growth as a result of this debt that is held?
I'd have to look into those studies. I can tell you that there's many historical examples and there's many papers that would assert the opposite insofar as that money is spent towards productive things, right? I mean, it's hard to say that a developing country can spend too much on like education or infrastructure or electricity, things like that, developing that type of thing, human and physical infrastructure. And it's also hard to say that a developed country has nothing else to spend on in that regard, right? I mean, dollars spent on education, dollars spent on infrastructure, dollars spent on preventative healthcare. These are things that pay themselves back in economic growth. And so I'm just, I don't think that the fear mongering surrounding government deficits or government spending is warranted. I think it's ahistorical.
Well, I just forwarded a study that basically called, I think it's a meta-analysis called Debt and Growth, a decade worth of studies. I can read out parts of it if you'd like, but basically it says that from a particular threshold of percentage to debt to GDP, then there is an effect on the economic growth of the country. I am aware that some companies, when I was investigating why do companies do stock buybacks instead of investing it in something, there was some traders that told me that some of them are concerned about the debt held in the country. They see it as a destabilizing element. For example, Argentina had something, I struggle to remember, but had something where the government held a lot of debt, had a lot of debt, and then at some like everything was kind of like normalized at some point, and people starting spending, and then another issue happened with like oil prices. I'm not exactly clear, and I don't remember specifically, but the government took on more debt, but the private sector didn't invest. They were like holding their breath to see what's happening because it reached a particular point where the debt is now a destabilizing force. So I'm happy for you to read the study because
Yeah.
I don't want to trip you up like in the middle. But I mean, I can
Well,
read.
well, yeah. Again, I don't think that this study's foundations are incorrect in the sense that they're grouping a lot of not very similar countries together, right? So I'm not making a broad prescription in this regard. Obviously, certain countries, especially developing countries, when they over leverage themselves, are going to have problems with their economy. They don't have the institutional strength, and they often do have problems with inflation if they do. The types of incredibly large spending programs for a persistent enough period of time on things that aren't very productive. Now, again, when we're talking about developing countries spending on, physical infrastructure, electrification projects, education, healthcare, it's hard to say that a developing country can spend too much on those types of things, although they can, obviously. That's number one. And then number two, you're applying an analysis that includes so many countries that can't issue debt in their own currency. They're not monetarily sovereign. They're developing countries with weak institutions, and comparing that conclusion with the United States, which has incredibly strong institutions, issues debt in its own currency, and is overall like essentially the biggest, most powerful country in the entire world. And so I don't think that this analysis is reasonable. After all, it seems like the highest and lowest thresholds here are internalized with the U.S., and it doesn't seem like we've had any substantial decreases in economic growth in association with our debt, in association with investor flight speculation that we're going to default on our debt. Investors don't tend to speculate that the U.S. is going to default on our debt. Number one, because it's illegal. The government of the United States is not legally allowed to default on its debt. And number two, because all the debt that we have to pay back, we pay back in a currency that we create. And so it's not really necessarily the most uh, so it's not the most surprising thing that we were able to have the fiscal space that we do in America. Same thing in the UK. Same thing in Japan. Same thing in Australia. So I mean, I don't take this analysis too seriously.
Okay, so I would admit it's difficult for me to have a debate specifically with someone who has a master's in economics, but I would just say that I was specifically talking about slowing economic growth, not defaulting on your debt. The study that I provided is a meta-analysis. Some of them, for example, went over 44 countries, 38 countries, 12 European countries, 18 OECD countries, 28 OECD countries, 155 countries, 23 advanced economies. So people can read it, I guess, in their own time, because I probably won't be able to debate it as effectively with Econoboy at the moment. I would like to move topic to regulations. So this is part of the reduction in
All right.
regulations is a big factor in my plan, and then a way to stimulate the economy, or
Yep.
get it to be more dynamic, more increase innovations, things of that nature. So I will just read this out just to not get it wrong. So I have two studies here that says about regulation. So I mentioned about the U.S. Chamber of Commerce saying that $1.9 trillion is lost in, what did I say specifically? Sorry. I said
Yep.
is lost in direct cost, lost productivity, and higher prices. So
Okay.
these other two studies saying we find that I'll send you the link in a second. We find that regulation has statistically and economically significant effect on aggregate output and factors that produce it, total factor productivity, physical capital, and labor. Regulations has caused substantial reductions in growth rates of both output and total factor productivity, and has had an effect on trends in capital and labor that vary over time in both sign and magnitude. Changes in regulation offer a straightforward explanation for the productivity slowdown in the 1970s. So I think they're talking about well, there's a lot of people debating about what happened in the 1970s, but let me just copy paste you the thing, so I won't leave you hanging. The other study I'll read a bit as well. We determined that this is about prices for lower income people. So we determined that regulations promote higher consumer prices, and that these price increases have a disproportionate negative effect of low-income households. Specifically, we find that the poorest households spend larger proportions of their income on heavily regulated goods and services prior to sharp price increases. I'll send that as well.
Yeah.
And
Yeah,
in addition, I do one last thing. Sorry, I just want to
Okay.
send like a graph that shows that over a period of 20 years, graph is particularly important. Over a period of 20 years, industries that are highly regulated, subsidized, or the government intervenes with them a lot, grow to become 200% more expensive, 160% more expensive, and things that the government still has some regulations, but less interventions overall, either become cheaper over time, things like cars, clothing, household furniture, cell phones, computer software, toys, and TVs, things that the government doesn't tend to necessarily regulate. And as a result, these things go over time. Part of the idea of my system is, even in the example of your negative income tax, it's you give them money to buy more expensive things that are more expensive because of these regulations. Once you free up the market to do its thing and reduce prices over time and increase the value of those things as a typical market would be expected to do, then poor people, even if they have slightly less money than in a UBI than negative income tax, will have access to more things, access to cheaper and fresher foods, cheaper televisions, cheaper cars, cheaper mobile phones, cheaper air conditioning, cheaper homes. All these things you can expect from a more dynamic and innovative market.
Yeah, sure. So I agree descriptively that regulations raise the cost of the goods that are associated with those regulations. I don't think anybody who is serious about economics or like finance or anything like that would disagree with that. Obviously, regulations increase the cost of doing business. However, the and the problem is that I think that the conclusions that some of your authors come to make me question their reasoning, right? So, the idea that yes, federal regulations increase the cost of consumer products to such an extent that it actually disproportionately affects lower income people. Now, My response to that would be a huge no shit. Everyone knew that already, right? Obviously, when you have regulations that affect consumer products, they're going to disproportionately affect lower income people. The question is, are those consumers better off without those regulations? This is one of the frustrations that I have with talking with more right leaning people in general is that oftentimes when we talk about regulations, the appeal is to broad regulations, right? Ah, yes, regulations are bad. The problem is that oftentimes they're somewhat remiss to talk about specific regulations. Now, me as like a progressive capitalist Stockton, like I call myself, I can talk about regulations that I think are stupid. I think it's dumb that doctors from Canada and the UK have to redo their residencies when they come to America. I think it's dumb that they don't have a special line to immigrate to America. I think that certificate of need laws seem pretty completely ridiculous. Like, you have to demonstrate, you have to have a need to build this new hospital. I mean, to me, just let them build the hospital. I don't see why you would need that. The fact that we cap the number of residencies and certificates that we give out for doctors and nurses every year. That's a ridiculous regulation. When it comes to housing, right? Things like the zoning laws and the environmental regulations we put on housing only seems to go to increase property values for current homeowners at the detriment of everyone else. And so there's room to get rid of a lot of regulations that would be advantageous in the fields of sort of housing and medicine, I would say, and probably a whole lot more. But the broad appeal to regulations and say, yes, regulations reduce economic growth, regulations increase prices. Of course, that's true, right? But in the words of Barack Obama, when he was defending the role of the ACA in regulating healthcare markets, he said, obviously, we would have much cheaper food if we didn't have an FDA. But would you really want to eat a lot of the food that you eat today if we didn't have an FDA? Which I think for most people, the answer is no. At least the answer was no for the people around the time when the FDA got formed. In general, when food standards and inspection standards were a lot low and you ended up eating a lot more shit in your meat than you would otherwise tolerate. And so I think that this is where the conversation needs to become more granular. I think that you have to look at specific regulations. What regulations are in the U.S. economy? What are they specifically costing us? And why would you advocate for getting rid of them? But just broadly saying regulations are bad, therefore that's a rationale for getting rid of 90% of them. I just don't think I don't think that's a well thought out policy. I don't think it's very tenable. And I think it would, like I said, I think it would just result in a lot of consumers getting taken advantage of.
Okay, let's do that. Let's get more granular. Before I do, I'd like to thank you for raising points that I would have already raised. Specifically, having certificate of need for hospitals in the US restricted doctors from coming from abroad or even moving across state lines. In addition, in 1997, the US government actually paid medical schools and hospitals to hire less doctors because there was a glut. Now, all these things obviously raise the price of healthcare because there's less doctors, less hospitals, less clinics, and all those things. And if those things were removed, or the government didn't even have a say in it, the market would have responded with lower price of healthcare. But let's get more granular in the example I wanted to do. So let's say this is close to reality. So supermarkets, when they purchase from third-party suppliers, they don't use or they don't rely on FDA regulators to adequately check their third-party suppliers, the people who supply them with food. So they send in an inspector of their own, which is 10 or 100 times more aggressive and rigid than the FDA. The FDA one is just lax, just like tick, 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 and goes out. It's a well-known thing in the food industry. And the private inspector, like he can knock you points off if there's a bolt on the floor where it shouldn't be. So it's because the incentive for the supermarket is not like it passes certain regulation. It has to look good. It doesn't have to. It has to have not any fungus, because if someone buys it, gets a stomachache, tells everyone on the internet that this supermarket gave me a bad product, that's them losing money. So it's nothing to do with tainted meat or anything like that. Obviously, that's bad. Yeah. But their standards are much higher. Would you agree that under those situations, you would remove the government from inspecting those places and let the free market regulate its, in this specific example, regulate its food providers.
Well, I mean, insofar as we're worried about regulations upping the price of consumer products, it doesn't sound like this regulation increases the price at all. You mentioned that the inspections that the grocery stores are paying for on a market basis are more expensive, right? So I don't really think having those inspectors provide a minimum standard, especially for companies that would otherwise not pay for those inspectors, is a bad thing. Even under your own logic, it doesn't sound like a bad thing.
Right, but even if I objectively just prove that government regulations, government inspectors are redundant and doing a worse job than the private sector itself, because the private sector has its own standards to higher standards to meet, you would rather the regulators come in, be paid a salary, a very generous pension, to come in and check these things, even though it's redundant.
Yeah, because you're assuming that the standard by which you've found for some or even most grocery stores, I'm not sure, frankly, is universal, which of course it's not, right? I mean, obviously, a lot of a lot of smaller grocery stores, a lot of medium-sized grocery stores, a lot of larger grocery stores are not going to want to pay an exorbitant rate for inspections in general, right? So I don't really see the problem with providing a minimum standard. You know, it's the same thing as yes, this private school is very good. It's actually better than most of the other public schools in the area. So we should just get rid of all public schools. Not really. I mean, I think that having a minimum standard that is available to everyone is fine. I think that's a good thing.
Okay, so let's say just the companies that were inspected by this third-party inspector do not need to be inspected by the government.
Yeah, I mean, if you wanted to say that there could be like some sort of licensed inspectors on a private market that governments could provide, similar to third-party auditors, I mean, that doesn't sound like the most unreasonable thing to me. But again, I feel like we're a far cry from, this is the rationale for why we need to get rid of 90% of regulations. We agree. I
Right,
mean, look,
but hold on.
Yeah, go on.
Again, just in this particular example, I just wanted to see if you relinquish control of the government. It doesn't seem like
No,
you're
again,
willing to do that.
No. Again, I've already given examples about how I'm not like ideologically tied to the government always providing more regulation, right? I just don't think that there is a sufficient basis to say that yes, sometimes regulations are bad, sometimes they're inefficient, sometimes they're just straight up stupid and don't make any sense.
Okay, we're talking
Therefore,
granular now.
that's the reason for getting rid of 90% of them. I mean, come on, that just these are,
I,
I feel
I,
like you need
I understand.
you'd have
But
to come up.
we're going granular as you've asked.
You'd
I'm
have
going
to come up
granular.
with bigger. I was imagining your examples would be bigger, though. That's kind of the thing, right? Like my examples were pretty big, but they don't rise to the point of 90% reduction in regulation.
Well, I mean, just to kind of interject here for just a second, I'm just kind of looking at my notes here. You did ask him to kind of go into more specific examples, so that does seem like he is moving into some specific examples there.
He is. I'm not saying he's not. I'm just saying, give me some big examples. Like what's the big example for justifying a 90% reduction in government regulation and apparatus? I mean, the food inspectors, that just doesn't seem like it would rise to that threshold.
Okay, so right now, in terms of pages, the federal regulation is 180,000 A4, or a bit more than 180,000 A4 papers. Now, I'm happy to keep regulations that have a risk of human life, or immediate risk of human life, or a somewhat serious risk of human life. I'm happy to keep those in as the 10%. But I can give you an example for the EU. There's on tractors, the windscreen wipers have 14 different regulations. Now, I think, maybe that, for example, we don't need regulators to, that's their job to pass laws because they're in an office and they need to do something to prove their paycheck. I don't think that sort of thing is necessary. I'm pretty sure the market can do that. So the 10%, so like 18,000 A4 pages of federal, not state, federal regulations, I think that's, legitimate. I really don't see like this need to say everything from those 180,000 pages are written in blood. That's certainly not the case. And it is even the vague ones are there just to kind of like enforce the will of the government, in a sense, because the vaguer those laws are, you don't know if you're breaking them or not. But the government can come in later and say, actually, you have broken them and you need to do this and that. So it's it's very, very difficult for business. I don't think you can reasonably expect anyone in any particular business to read 180,000 A4 pages just to start up a business or do to read all those regulations.
Yeah, I mean, I agree that it's going to be hard to grasp all the regulations. I mean, it's a good thing that businesses don't have to typically grasp every regulation of the federal government. Obviously, they're specialized businesses, right? And they're going to be more or less regulated depending on what they do. And so I don't think that's a burden that most businesses have. And with regard to the idea of, why can't we have 18,000 pages versus 180,000? I just think it's not very well thought out, right? Again, I guess to go uh, broader, I guess, with regards to these specific examples, you talk about the windshield wipers in the EU. I think that we can agree to some extent that yeah, there's going to be a lot of regulations that if we took a pass on them, they just don't make sense. A lot of them are either redundant, a lot of them don't make any sense, a lot of them are stupid, a lot of them are irrelevant, right? Because the market may have adopted some standard for one reason or another. But I think that tying yourself to some arbitrary number of yes, we need to have a 90% reduction. I mean, that's about as little thought out as someone saying more regulation, more better, right? I mean, I don't see the point in tying yourself to some minimum standard when the smarter thing from my perspective is just to go regulation by regulation and say, yeah, I mean, those regulations make sense, those ones don't. I mean, why tie yourself to such a strict standard, because you're going to be cutting off such incredibly huge chunks of the government apparatus. I mean, securities regulation. You mentioned, if it involves life or death. Well, I mean, securities fraud doesn't necessarily involve life or death, but it certainly screws over a lot of consumers whenever it happens, right? I mean, I don't think that getting rid of all those regulations makes sense.
So there's a few things I can address that, but I would like to start with the first one. How would you, we both agree that these regulations are bad, or certain regulations are bad, how would you go about changing them?
Yeah, I mean, I think that as far as I'm aware, there's kind of two ways that regulations get made. It's statutory authority by Congress, or it's the rulemaking authority of executive branches. And so I guess it would depend on who you are, whether you're the president or you're the leader of Congress. But I mean, those are the two ways that, I can think of.
How would Econoboy change regulations?
Well, I said you'd
No,
go
not
through the.
not as a elected official. How would you as a citizen change it?
Oh, I see what you're saying. Yeah, I mean, it depends on the regulation. I mean, I mentioned local and federal regulations. What you'd want to do is you'd want to advocate for those regulations. You'd want to vote in people that have your shared point of view, and hopefully, if you have enough, base of support, that those regulations are going to get passed through. Right? We live in a democracy. That's what you got to do to make change and make laws.
Okay, so I would say that's a highly futile attempt. Let's say, just mathematically speaking, let's say that I'm in a state that has 5 million people. My vote is actually 1 divided by 5 million to perhaps affect the outcome of the election.
Yeah.
In addition to that, the two candidates that are running may not have the specific desire that I have. They come in a bundle. One is bundle A, one is bundle B. And my particular desire may not be in either of those, or it may exist in one of them, but all the other things in the basket are so negative that I don't even want that it outweighs my particular change. So I have almost no effect on the outcome of the election, and there may not be even a politician that advocates for my position.
Well,
So
I mean,
it doesn't seem like it's a good way to do it.
Well, like it's the only way to do it, really. I mean, you advocated for two constitutional amendments, right? I mean, talk about an uphill battle, right? I mean, that's way harder to get done than just voting in a legislator that's going to bring voice to a regulation you want to get changed. I don't think that it's unreasonable to say that the legal apparatuses that surround us can be a little bit rigid, and it can be a little hard for one person to bring voice to that. But I mean, unless you're advocating a violent overthrow of the government, then I mean, that's kind of what you're stuck with. I mean, again, you advocated for constitutional amendments. I don't know through what metrics you imagined those, through what mechanisms you imagined those amendments getting passed, but I mean, that's a legal process, a democratic process.
So I'm just giving a particular example where if you, a particular person, say, I particularly don't like this one regulation. I think this one particular regulation hurts my business or hurts my particular ability to do something as an individual. Because if, for example, I wanted to pass my plan, I would have to gather support from the majority of the country, not just my particular area. But if it's just me singular trying to vote on something, that singular person will find it more difficult. Are you advocating that I now need to go out, knock on doors just to change a particular regulation?
Well, I mean, yeah, if the regulation really meant that much to you, I mean, again, you're advocating for constitutional amendments, which are 100 times harder to pass than, again, just getting a legislator elected to bring voice to a regulation you want to change,
Economist,
especially if it's just
you're
a local
ignoring
regulation,
you're
right?
ignoring my point. I
I feel like I'm
understand
not.
and
I'm
I
directly
understand
addressing.
and okay, I understand and appreciate that. I'm obviously like a constitutional amendment requires a lot of people. I'm aware of that, and I'm aware that I have to persuade a lot of people, and I'm trying to do so. But changing a particular regulation, saying, look, do we really need these 14 regulations on windscreen wipers? And can we please vote in a particular candidate? I can even knock on doors and say, well, we think those 14 regulations on windscreen wipers are dumb, but this other candidate has more of the overall things we like. And we don't, and we appreciate that, this other person doesn't have those particular, I mean specifically in the state, not countrywide. This person like has other things that we like more. And then in addition, that person, let's say, is elected, they have to fight and gather support from everyone else in the Congress or Senate. I'm not exactly sure which particular body, but
Yeah, I
it's
get you're saying it's hard to pass. I get what you're saying. You're repeating yourself, right? You're just saying it's hard for one person to get a regulation changed, and I don't disagree, right? But again, all the criticisms you're making of my sort of institutional approach are the same criticisms of your approach, but times 100 because you're advocating for amendments. Now, what I would say, in order to not repeat myself with that regard, is just to say that no, I don't think that saying, well, one person's vote doesn't make a big difference or one person can't make a huge difference. That's a reason why we need to essentially advocate for going through the same institutional mechanisms, but advocate for like 1,000 times more extreme policy. I just don't, to me, that doesn't make any sense. I don't know why those two things would, I don't know why one would necessarily follow the other, right?
why you you said, I don't understand why in your particular example you're comparing to my system is my problem. You said that
You
in your
advocated for an
system.
institutional
Yeah,
change.
I understood. You said that in your system you agreed with me that these regulations are necessary. But when I ask you how would you solve them in your own system, you said, well,
Some
compared to your
regulations.
system, I need like you need like 100 times more. Like, okay, in your own system, on your own, how would you fix problematic regulations? Let's just say the
I've already
certificate of
said
need.
how. Yeah, I've already
So
said how. I don't understand what, again, I feel like I don't know if there's a misunderstanding here. All I'm saying is that we both advocated for institutional solutions to these problems. You advocated for a couple of constitutional amendments. I advocated for basically lobbying your legislature in one way or another, a multitude of ways, right? You're saying, well, one person can only have so much difference that they can make in that regard because we live in like a broad-based democracy. Whereas what I'm saying is that, well, you need about 100 times more of a broad-based support to pass constitutional amendments, right? So if you really cared about getting rid in a smart granular sense of, regulations, then you would basically work to make those regulatory change at the legislative level with your individual legislatures. I mean, to me, that's the best way to do it.
okay, so in both of our cases, you're saying we need to gather wide support, cross-country support through many different states, through many
It depends
different
on the regulation.
legislators.
Some
Well,
regulations you'd only need to
certificate of
talk
need,
to
let's
your
say.
city council member.
Certificate of need, let's say.
Yeah, that would be your state. So you're not even a federal problem at that point. You just need to lobby your state legislature.
Why haven't they got rid of certificate of need already? It doesn't seem like seems like a bit of a no-brainer.
Well, there could be a multitude of reasons, right? I think that some of the rationale for a certificate of need in the first place is probably that it's a broad-based certificate of need demonstration, and not necessarily just with regards to hospitals. But if it's just with regard to hospitals, it might be the case that having hospitals that are able to be built literally everywhere could be inefficient. It could be the case that you'd want to centralize control of that to some extent to be sure that you're spreading out hospitals advantageously and equitably. There's a lot of reasons and rationales why you would want certificate of needs. I'm just saying that I don't really agree with those rationales. I don't think it's a big conspiracy, though. I just think that you'd need to lobby your state legislature in order to get rid of them. You'd need to make the case.
Okay, so if I have a real life story, not a hospital, but a lady that works with special needs kids, she wants to open her own clinic to work with special needs kids in Louisiana, and she was denied the certificate of need because not because anyone said that they don't need it, but because the regulator says we have too much regulatory burden at the moment and we can't regulate the addition of your clinic in our area.
Yeah.
Well, they denied her livelihood, and special needs kids aren't able to come to her clinic.
So you're saying, what should she do about that? That's the question?
Well, what she should do about it, I suppose, is, I don't know, get a lawyer and do something and sue the regulator. But
right.
Here is an example of not a hospital, but a clinic. The regulatory body has the power to deny them access to their livelihood and access to give service to, or healthcare service to people in need. And the system itself, it doesn't need a tweak. It needs a bit more than a tweak.
Right. So, okay. So my response to that woman would be what I've already said, right? You need to contact your legislature. You need to contact your representative. You need to go through the institutional solutions and democratic apparatuses that surround you in order to get that hospital built. Or you need to move to a state without those requirements, like whatever the explanation would be. That is a lot easier, in my view, than what you would tell her. Now, what would you tell her in that situation?
I think it involves a lawyer, to be honest with you. I think she did call those people already, but they didn't have any influence or sway over the regulatory body there.
Okay, what would you tell her?
Get a lawyer.
Okay, so we agree then. I don't understand. The line of questioning. I'm
no,
not
we
sure
don't.
What the
we
point
don't
is.
agree because I'm saying the system itself is bureaucratic and inefficient and problematic. We need to a bit more than tweak it.
So what you're saying is that my solution, which is contact your state representative or get a lawyer, like whatever you need to do, like work with your local board in order to change the system so that you can get your certificate of need, or change the system surrounding certificate of needs. You're saying that is hopeless. However, telling her,
no, I'm not saying that.
Hold on. Let me finish. Hold on. Well, okay, it's either hopeless or it's pointless to the sense that we need to fix the whole system. So instead of telling her that, instead of telling her that, you would say, yes, you know what the realistic thing to do is, madam? We need to start knocking on doors to pass 2 constitutional amendments so that we can reduce the size of government by 90% and provide everyone a UBI of $1,000 a month. How the fuck does $1,000 a month UBI have to do with your problem of trying to open this special needs clinic? Well, your guess is as good as mine, but that's the only suggestion I got.
Econoboy, I think you're being a bit dishonest and condescending here, and I don't really appreciate it. You're really acting. You are acting bad faith. I'm saying.
I'm not.
Well, let me explain what I have said. I've said in her particular case, she should get a lawyer and solve the problems. You and I should fix the system. That's what I'm saying.
Again, but you haven't. Okay, so we would tell her the same thing. Is kind of what I'm getting at.
Do you understand? Do you understand what I'm communicating with you? It doesn't. It seems like it's just not.
Okay,
not
you just said you tell her to get a lawyer in order to fix the problem. Okay, I'm saying, yeah, I'd probably agree with that. I would just add on contacting your state representative. Okay, so apparently, it sounds like we would agree in terms of telling her what to do to solve her problem. However, the difference would be that you would advocate also for these constitutional amendments, whereas I would not advocate for those constitutional amendments. Now,
so you would keep the system as it is. The system, even though it has problems here and there, we would work within the system. Hopefully, fight the different special interest groups, the different senators and Congress people and whatnot. We will work within the system, but we won't try to do a little bit more than that. We won't try to fix the core issue that the system is bureaucratic, the system is inefficient, it produces bad results that outright hurt people and outright either stop them from working, stop them from getting cheap healthcare, stop them from getting baby formula, stop them from getting cheap insulin. All these things we just need to gather some people, and maybe like a year or two, or 2 to 4 years, when the election happens, we can replace someone and do something about it. The system itself produces these results. That's what I'm trying to have a discussion about in a good faith nature on the internet. It's not like me having this theoretical framework is not worth discussing, because I think it is. So I
Yeah,
don't
but
understand why you're being condescending about it and
I'm
not
not being
engaging with the topic.
condescending.
You're in good faith.
If you feel condescended towards, it's not because of anything that I said. Now, what we can move on in order to address the main problem. If the main problem is, over bureaucratic processes that prevent people from being able to sort of go about their daily lives, I don't think your system necessarily solves that problem, because it's it's like a what's the saying? It's a blunt instrument, right? You're saying, ah, yes, arbitrarily, I've decided that 90% of regulations can probably go away, and so we're going to kind of start hacking away until we have some absolute basic level of regulations that people can follow. What I'm saying, though, is that if we're broadening out the point, is that when you start hacking away like that, you end up falling a lot of people end up falling through the cracks one way or another. We had a society with a hell of a lot less regulation than we had today. It was a world with, like I said, a bunch of shit in the meat that you're eating, a world with securities fraud that was rampant, a world with capital markets that were totally fucked, a world with healthcare that was, had certainly a large number of snake oil salesmen in it. Now, you can start saying that, ah, yes, all those good regulations are the ones that we would keep. But the problem is that without being able to clearly define what's good, it's hard to really I suppose counteract your arbitrary line of 90% of regulations need to go. I just don't think that you're able to demonstrate something like that. I think that, like I said before, when we sort of got on the regulations topic, is that I think it's poorly thought out. I think that if you really
Okay, let
cared
me.
about reducing, I think that if you
I
really cared
understand.
about, hold on,
I understand.
no, I think if you really cared about reducing regulatory burden, I think that
Mhm.
you would apply a purely granular analysis, regulation by regulation, rather than saying, 90% sounds about right to me. I mean, it seems ridiculous to me.
I see what the problem is now. I think you've missed an important point. Maybe I haven't explained it. Do you think markets can self-regulate themselves?
I think they can. It's
Yes.
possible. Depends on the
Mhm.
market.
So I gave the example of the supermarket, right? So they want quality food. They have a way to regulate their own quality food to a higher standard than the government. So this could be an example of self-regulating markets. Is that accurate?
Um, no, because I don't think that would be a universal standard. But insofar as I can grant the point, though, that there are some examples of markets regulating themselves in order to provide good service to customers. Sure.
Okay, so in general, do you think that if we were in a market, okay, let me actually look a different way. Is the internet regulated?
Yeah, the internet does have regulations surrounding it
From government or the companies that
from government and from the companies themselves, like TOS standards, in addition to many government regulations.
does the government regulate, like if I buy something on Amazon, that something won't cheat me, or if I say a swear word or something really heinous on this platform, will someone from the government come and do something with me? Or is it more the case that companies themselves figure out a way to regulate, ensure some quality of standard to what they provide?
Well, no,
Or
there's
is
a
it
lot
like
of
fully government regulated? Yep, go ahead.
no. So nothing. Those are two different questions, right? So does the government regulate when you buy something on Amazon? The answer is yes. There's a ton of regulations internalized with that process. And well, with regards to the second question, which is, or is this entirely government regulated? I mean, I don't think that there's anything that is, entirely government regulated or entirely market regulated. We have a mixed system, right? I mean, there's going to be some industry standards that get adopted, and there's going to be obviously some government enforced standards that get adopted, right? In pretty much every industry at least that I can think of.
Can you give me an example, just for my general knowledge, what does the government regulate Amazon in?
Yeah, sure. I mean, all their workers are covered under OSHA. You have to give basic safety standards to all of your employees. With regards to how you build your infrastructure, there's a ton of local and state and federal regulations when you
Right.
build a warehouse.
Sorry. I
Yeah.
meant specifically when you buy something on their website and you're not cheated by the product that you buy.
Yeah, so there's product safety laws. You can't false advertise, right? You can't just say this product does something when it doesn't. You have to present a competitive price, but not something that's below the marginal cost, right? You cannot take advantage of your monopoly power. There's a ton of regulations in that regard.
And if someone sells something from China that goes through Amazon, those laws apply?
Well, when someone sells something from China, if they want to sell it to American consumers through
Yeah.
the Amazon platform, then those regulations do apply. Like Amazon would be held liable for any breach in consumer standards for American products, even if they originate overseas.
Right. So Amazon would kind of regulate that element themselves to not get in trouble with anyone else.
Well,
And even if
Amazon would, well, no, because Amazon would follow the government regulations. That's not the same thing as Amazon regulating itself.
I worked in this industry. I didn't see a lot of government regulations that I needed to follow. So I'm not exactly following what it is that you mean.
Well, yeah, it's probably because a lot of the regulations that I'm describing, it turns out they're not actually that burdensome, right? I mean, having basic product safety standards, labeling standards, worker safety standards, while they do increase the cost of doing business to some extent, they're not so burdensome that it basically makes economic growth impossible, right? So, I mean, I think that that's probably why you didn't notice a lot of the things that I'm describing. Because regulations, I mean, most regulations work out just fine, It's kind of my position.
In general, like companies in Silicon Valley do not face that much regulations. I mean, I'm not
I
saying they have
really
zero. I'm not saying they have
disagree.
zero, but they definitely don't face that many regulations. So I'm not sure what you are talking about.
You don't. Okay, so I totally disagree that I don't think I think Silicon Valley, basically tech startups do face a lot of regulation. If you want to talk about starting a data center or providing a technology for consumers, these are things that face a lot of regulation. And I don't think it's fair to say. Well, I just don't think that they do. I mean, I don't know what to say other than they do. They do face a lot of. I named a lot of the examples of regulations that
Yeah,
they might face.
I'm happy like with things like OSHA and stuff like that. If you have a factory, that's fine. I don't not disagreeing with that. And certainly like labeling and stuff like that. That's something Amazon themselves don't make those products. The labeling is dependent on the company that is selling it. But Amazon specifically, like, or let's say for example eBay, they have their own like self-regulatory system. They have the recommendation system with the stars. They used to have, I think they still have PayPal that used to take care of fraud and things like that. All that was done inside the company without any regulators coming on checking them.
Yeah, so again, eBay and Amazon, they are transitively accountable to all of those regulations from the individual supplier. Now, it depends on what they're selling, right? Because Amazon doesn't just they're not just a marketplace, right? They also buy products and direct sell as well. So those, in both cases, though, they're accountable to all of those consumer regulations and worker regulations in those regards, right? And so I feel like at the end of the day, though, I've given some specific examples of what they have to follow, whereas you're saying, well, I just don't think that they have to follow that many regulations. Now,
Well,
we can
what
go
I said
back to the
specifically,
we can go back to the original agreement, which was that I don't think that companies completely fail to self govern themselves. I just think that the government has a important role in applying those minimum standards where the market doesn't necessarily universally adopt those standards.
so
All
I
right.
think
Guys, I'm sorry to cut in. You may not know this, but we're almost at the hour and a half mark. So we're actually after you respond here, PZ, we're gonna move into closing statements, and then we're gonna move into the Q&A. So go ahead and respond, and then Econoboy, you can give your closing statement.
All right, let's do it.
is this my closing statement or just a response?
No, you can just respond right now.
Okay, so I specifically in the case that I was referring to, again, like with regards to worker safety and with regards to product being labeled in something that the worker safety is fine. I agree with that. And let's say minimum wage regulations in Silicon Valley, all that's valid. The labeling of the product, that depends on the merchant. If, for example, someone sold you a bad product or they cheated you, that would be handled on PayPal or even your credit card before it goes to any government-related things, that they would kind of solve those things on their level before you need to engage in anything government, or the government needs to verify those things. In general, the government has not regulated Silicon Valley at all. It's very difficult, at all, to a large extent. It's very difficult to regulate bits and bytes. It's easier to regulate things and people. But in general, the Silicon Valley has not been very heavily regulated to a very large degree. I'm sure you realize that the internet has its own mechanisms, for example, the TOS, and there's a wide variety of things that things just regulate themselves. And the reason for that is that if we didn't have those things, and every other email was a Nigerian scam letter, or every other thing you bought on Amazon was broken and was a cheap Chinese ripoff, then the system would stop working and people would stop buying stuff from the internet. So the system itself has an incentive to regulate itself and to provide value to the people, so that every time you do a trade, that trade is beneficial to both sides. And if you don't have that, then people simply won't trust that system and won't adopt it. So in and of itself, that element is there.
I'm sorry. Are you guys? I had to go let my dog in. Did you guys finish your closings here?
I just responded.
Okay. Let's move into the closings though, so we can get to the Q&A portion. I wish we had a little more time for this debate now, kind of in hindsight, but this is what I had factored in. Econoboy, go ahead with your closing, and then we'll move over to Philosophical Zombie Hunter.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, pretty good debate, good discussion. Thanks, Philosophical Zombie Hunter and Andrew, for hosting it and making it happen. I had a good time. I guess to round out my thoughts on the issue, I would just say that it's important not to have incredibly strict ideological standards for as the basis that you would advocate for certain economic policy or policy in general. Really, it reminds me of a time when I talked to actually Vosh in our second debate about socialism, to which I posed the question. Um, it was something along the lines of, unless you're ideologically tied to a notion of socialism, I just don't really see how your system and his system was basically make everything a worker cooperative, how that's better for workers, right? Necessarily better for workers. To which his response was, honestly, well, I am ideologically tied to that notion, right? I just think that that's bad, right? And I don't think that it's reasonable to say that even if society is net worse off, well, my ideology has been achieved insofar as, well, the structures that I advocate for are in place, even if people are poor or even if people have less money or less freedom or whatever the circumstance is, right? And I think that in the case of, obviously Philosophical Zombie Hunter, the idea of, I like markets, hate regulation, and so I advocate for a UBI instead of welfare, and I advocate for getting rid of 90% of the government apparatus, including most regulation. I just think that that's an ideological notion, and it's not really well thought out. I think that if we were being well thought out in terms of what regulations are good and bad, it would be a purely granular discussion about which regulations we want and don't want. And although to some extent we had that discussion, I don't think that any of the regulations that both of us mentioned as regulations that we don't want rise to the level of, well, that does it. We took a sample and we found, 5 or 6 or 10 or 20, even 100 regulations that we don't like. And so therefore that's the reason to upend the entire system, start cutting out vast swaths of the regulatory apparatus. He mentions, I like labeling laws. I like OSHA. Well, I mean, that's probably tens of thousands of regulations right there. And when you've only got apparently 18,000 pages to work with, I mean, again, you end up cutting away a lot of regulations that are really, really important. Again, we had a society with really, really low regulations for a really, really long time. And it ended up being that a lot of consumers got taken advantage of. A lot of people got fucked, basically, in an undue sense. And I think that rather than saying we need to get rid of some X percentage of regulation, for every one regulation we get rid of 2 or 3, we need to just say these regulations make sense. These regulations don't make sense. And to me, that's the best way to do it. I feel like Philosophical Zombie Hunter also failed to advocate for the first part of his plan, which was the UBI versus the negative income tax, or just a broad social apparatus. And so, in general, the last thing that I'll say is that when it comes to welfare and how the government can interact with people in that regard, I think that it's best when we have a somewhat cash-based, somewhat universal system of benefits with income taxes that are progressive and a lot higher on higher income people so that we can distribute income to those that need it. And I think that with regards to regulations, it's really important to take a granular approach.
Thanks for that closing. Go ahead, PZH.
Yeah, I had a lot more to discuss. I didn't really have a chance to do all those things. Again, my system kind of, well, I don't think there's any harm having discussions about the system. I think it is well thought out. I just didn't have a chance to present a lot of it. I do feel that the crux of the idea is basically that we need to shrink the government, have the government do a very specific set of things that they're very good at. Otherwise, they will just tend to be very bureaucratic, very inefficient, and you will have these laws, as I mentioned, that insulin is very expensive because the FDA regulates who can produce it, and we can't import it. We can't do all these things because of all these laws. Baby formula is now on the news because the FDA it's a heavily regulated industry. I didn't really get into all the things the FDA is really bad at, but I think that the overall idea is that we have a system that we want the government to do a very specific set of specific things, and then we want the market to pick up. People solve problems very, very well. The markets themselves have mechanism to self-regulate themselves in the terms of business insurance, in the terms of a variety of different things, and unfortunately, I didn't have a chance to. But the internet, for example, is a good example. Silicon Valley, in of itself, I would state, doesn't have that much regulations, and we saw a lot of innovation, a lot of growth, a lot of things that people use across the world. You have a situation where someone in Africa, in the middle of like a very secluded area, has a mobile phone and can read Wikipedia at something that's compressed for the mobile that he is using, and that's like a benefit for the entire world. These are the kinds of market-based things that we need to do to increase in our society, to improve the quality of life of people. I don't think that Econoboy is going to get any of the things that he wanted. He can suggest the Norway style this, Norway style that. It doesn't matter. He's unable or will be unable to get any of those things done. And as an example of this, California, for example, recently wanted to do just implement single payer of their own. They have a supermajority Democrats. They have 55 billion extra from taxes, but they turned down. They wanted to do it, but they just said it couldn't be achieved in that state. So if California cannot do it, sorry, with all that political firepower and all that extra money, then it's just obvious that Econoboy himself isn't able to achieve what he wants. I still like my idea, and I hope it is discussed more often in the future. Thank you.
Yeah, I appreciate that too. Everybody, make sure that you like and subscribe and do all that stuff that you do to make the channel grow and all that junk, right? So I have a couple of quick questions here, but before I get into it, everybody make sure that you tune in tomorrow. We've got Pedro versus Nick. If you don't remember Nick, he was the husband of Not So Erudite, who was in the 2v2 versus N. Shapiro and Rachel. So that ought to be an interesting debate tomorrow night. Also, next week, we've got JF Gary Epi coming up with Synth. We've got a bunch of great debates next week coming up as well. And then Monday, we have of course, ultimate trash talk extravaganza, Back to the Left. So got a lot of stuff coming up for you guys. So Econoboy, for you first, you bring up a good point. And, Zombie, I didn't really hear you answer to it. He said, what if these private companies use a TOS that's so overboard on speech and have a monopoly? At that point, don't you kind of want to have a government around to put a stop to it?
Well, sorry,
yeah.
who was that intended to? You or in
Yeah, who was it for?
That was to PZH. I was just saying, Econoboy brought this point up, so I didn't really hear it responded to.
Oh, okay. Sorry, I didn't hear Econoboy mention the point. People, this is an old argument, but from like a capitalist point of view, people's company are the private property, and if they have a particular TOS that's too restrictive, then what you basically can do is find another platform, which I'm sure Andrew is very familiar with that process, and Brittany from Politically Provoked are also familiar with that process. But yeah, that's my, I guess, more ideological take than a practical answer.
Well, I'm not familiar with it because I don't get banned because I follow the terms of service. But
Yep.
you are right that politically provoked, I'm sure, is quite familiar with it. But moving back to the question, I get that, right? I understand the answer of, if you don't like it, go elsewhere. However, that doesn't really answer to the monopolization portion of that question, does it? Which is to say, hey, if there's a monopolization on the public square and they're regulating speech to the point where nobody really has it anymore because this is the means in which we communicate, people aren't really even equipped to write letters anymore. Not kidding about that. Don't you want to have a government actually come in and regulate and advocate on behalf of your rights at that point?
Well, I don't know if I would say that that's particularly rights based. If the government comes in, they're violating the rights of the company that set up a particular TOS. So let's say they built up a certain platform, then they change the TOS, and now they're a monopoly. I think that that clearly we have alternatives. They may not be as popular as larger players in the market, but if there is a need, if a particular company has a large user base and then a lot of those user base are unhappy with that service, then a need is generated in the market and someone will come to fill it. It may take a little bit of time, but obviously we can see that there's several alternatives at the moment.
Yeah, just I'm sorry, but I'm going to kind of press you on this a little bit.
Okay.
So Donald Trump, who was the president of the United States, got banned from Twitter, which was a huge blow, obviously, to him and his following and this and that, and his ability to then tell his audience and people who followed him, the various things that he wanted to tell them. Now, you say that you can go to these kind of media alternatives, but those media alternatives don't have the same type of user base and they're not as user friendly. And it doesn't seem like they have just adapted to the market need, even though there seems to desperately be one right now, right? It's maybe not as easy as people think to do. I'm just wondering, now that this becomes the medium, the town square, the public hall, and that's what this really is, a facilitation of conversations from across the globe. If you allow a consolidation of one power to hold on to all of that, why wouldn't you want antitrust to come in, maybe break that up, or maybe have government regulation say, hey, you can't just throw people because you don't like how they look, things like this?
I think I'll take this kind of like two positions on it. I'll see if I can try to answer your question more directly though.
Mm-hmm.
So I agree with Elon Musk saying that banning Trump was a mistake, and that then now he moved to another platform and he still has a voice, just somewhere else. It's not like banning him on this platform silenced him entirely. So he's still part of the town square, just somewhere else, or the town square is now fragmented. But I think it's kind of interesting that a company can ban someone like the president. It kind of is interesting that the US has that degree of freedom that can happen. I think it's, in a sense, like in a perhaps libertarian sense, quite interesting that if you want to ban the president and from your platform, you're able to do so and without any recourse. It's, in a sense, it's kind of interesting.
Well, and then kind of to pose that same question to you, Econo Boy, it seems like that could set a very dangerous precedent if you just have no regulation, you allow government monopolies to control speech.
Well, you're saying, so from my perspective, what would I do regarding monopolization of social media companies and stuff like that? Yeah, I mean, I would say that to me it's a hard okay, so to me it's hard to advocate for basically platform regulation of these companies because we did live in a world for a long time where it seemed that messages could get across without the use of social media companies. And I am uncomfortable with saying to a company, you have to platform a certain person, despite the fact that you don't want to. and I would worry about the implications of such a regulation. And so presently, I don't really think it's appropriate for the government to say, you can or cannot platform these people based on essentially, their political ideology. I just don't think political ideology is a protected class.
Okay. Hang on a second. There was one here from your favorite person, Synth. He says, question for Econo Boy, what reason would you give to pull people away from being ideologically tied to things like the NAP, a lack of regulation?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I don't really know. I don't really have a great answer because people, well, I mean, just people who are ANCAPs or people who have like those more strict ideological ties, they've typically developed them over at least a decent period of time. I think that it's almost like asking how to de-radicalize someone. I think that it takes a long time. I think that it takes a lot of personal conversations, and it probably takes surrounding that person with informed people that can counter their points of view and hopefully breaking them out of the rabbit hole to some extent. In terms of what reasons I would give specifically, I would try and do similarly to what I did in this debate, just point out the sort of broad need for regulations and how having, we have some agreement on how regulations are bad, but having, again, like an ideological notion of, this X percent of regulations or get rid of all regulations, get rid of the state, oftentimes the failures of these systems are niche enough that the rationale for getting rid of the whole systems just doesn't, to me, make as much sense.
Gotcha. Speaking of Synth, he'll also be taking on Made by Jim Bob on veganism next week. I can't wait to see that one. That's going to be it's going to be a fun one. Gentlemen, that's the questions that we had for this particular debate. I know that economics is stunning and thrilling for everybody, but there are some people who I don't think dive into it like others do, right? Why don't you take a second, Econo Boy, shout your channel out before we shut this thing down.
Yeah, sure. Like I said at the beginning, if you're interested in hearing about economics, mostly economics, I should say, and politics every now and then you can sub to my YouTube channel, give me money on Patreon, follow my Twitch, follow my Twitter. Pretty much all those platforms, I have various levels of economic commentary and political commentary. Obviously, I'm a center left kind of guy, progressive left person. So if you're scared at the words that I might say, that I might convince you to be part of the gay, trans, take your guns away mob, then I guess don't come to any of my platforms. But if you want to hear a different view, then come to my platforms and hang out and have a good time.
Yeah, I would say that it's certainly a different view than, all of left-wing Twitch, which is all left-wing. So that's why you should go to Econo Boy for sure. I'm kidding, Econo Boy. Couldn't help myself. PZH, shout your channel out real quick, man.
So Philosophical Zombie Hunter on YouTube. Don't have a Patreon. I'm doing fine. Don't need it. But
give
if you just
Econo
wanna-
Boy your Patreon money. It's like it'll be like a UBI, bro. You can lead by example.
Maybe he'll get into charities and actually wait. You don't like? We didn't get a chance to discuss charities, but Econo Boy, who likes the government and everything, wants us to pay him to his Patreon, which is a charity. So I suppose that's interesting. Yeah, and basically just come to the channel, look at some debates and some chill talks. That's about it.
Okay, guys. Appreciate it so much. From everybody at the Crucible to everybody at home, happy Friday. Hope that, you have fun doing whatever the hell you do on a Friday night. Hopefully that's getting drunk, eating red meat, having sex, doing all that great stuff with your family and wife that you're supposed to be doing. Have a great night.